we got to handle business and talk about the college football playoff rankings, give you our real reaction. We did this last night in a one-off video, so I didn't want to just kind of go through that same conversation of, well, here's what we think about the rankings. Is this fair? Is this not fair? I think the committee got it right. To kind of preface this whole conversation. But the other part of that I want to address is the path and the edge for these top 6 teams as it pertains to the rest of the season. So at number 1, it's Ohio State. We knew it would be Ohio State. You probably knew it would be Ohio State. They have the best resume in the country. We said it last night on our one-off video. I'll say it one more time. Men lie, women lie. Resumes don't lie unless you are a finance major trying to get a summer internship. In that case, like, do what you got to do. No judgment here. 2 top 10 wins, 1 on the road at Notre Dame. Took care of business at home against Penn State. We saw that in living color, live in living color. That was pretty awesome. Like, this is a team that is built to go the distance if they continue to trend the right way. So the path for Ohio State when it comes to a national championship and the college football playoff, like, same song, second, third verse, whatever you want to call it, like, it is that yellow brick road heading right to Ann Arbor, Michigan for a crash course yet again with the Michigan Wolverines. Even if Michigan loses to Penn State, let's just say they drop that game at State College as the Wolverines. Probably make the Buckeye faithful pretty happy. That's first and foremost. Second part of this, the impact of that game in my mind is still the same. Like, there's still enormous stakes. There's still a huge playoff impact on that game. So I'm not even worried about the Michigan-Penn State game at this point in time. The Michigan-Ohio State game will still have the same impact in my mind. Now, when it comes to the edge for Ohio State in this whole college football playoff discussion, I think they're built differently than the last couple of years. And to take it a step further, I think they're built much better to match up with Michigan. And you say, well, JD, yeah, the defense looks good. Yes, defense looks great. First of all, averaging 10 points a game allowed. That's first. But you're going to say, well, what do they have at quarterback? Like, it's not C.J. Stroud out there. It's Kyle McCord. Is Kyle McCord really going to be the guy to beat Michigan for you? The answer is I don't know, but I would say this. C.J. Stroud played awesome in both those games against Michigan the last 2 years, threw for over 300 yards, which kind of leads me to believe, like, the offense in terms of what they have throwing the football, you would like to have that, I would have to imagine, but that wasn't the differentiating factor. That wasn't what got you over the hump against Michigan. So does Kyle McCord have to play well against Michigan? 110%. We all are on the same page there. We all agree with that. He has to bring his A game in that spot for them to win the football game. But does he have to throw for 400 yards to beat them? I don't think that's the formula. I think the formula is stopping the run much better than you have in the past. And I think the formula is being able to control the game much more than you have in the past. So I think Ohio State, by that logic, is in a better spot to match up with Michigan. So we'll break that game down when it gets here. Now at number 2, you got Georgia. And Georgia has a ranked win on the resume, convincing win over Florida. So if you're into the recency bias side of things, I mean, that win over Florida probably sent a pretty strong message to the playoff committee of like, hey, look at us. Look at what we're doing here. Don't forget about the dogs. The path for them is about to get a little bit more steep, a little bit more treacherous. A lot made about who Georgia hasn't played and who they didn't play in non-conference. Side note, they tried to play Oklahoma, and the kibosh was put on that. I'm just saying, rent is about to be due right now for Georgia when it comes to this college football playoff conversation. If chalk holds, they have 3 top 20 teams the next 3 weeks. They got Missouri, they got Ole Miss, and that Ole Miss game could be a top 10 matchup now, depending on what happens this week. And then they go to Tennessee. So even Georgia Tech to finish the season, Georgia Tech, I think, could be a little bit sneaky by nature of what we've seen them do with Haynes King and company. Not saying they're going to get upset. I'm just saying that game you will still have to show up for when you play the Yellow Jackets. Now, the edge for them. The obvious edge is they're extremely multiple, right? Like offensively for Georgia, they're running the ball for right around 175 yards a game. They're throwing the ball for well over 300. And it's kind of a complex conversation to approach because the last thing you want to say is it's ever a good situation to not have Brock Bowers in the lineup, because that's not true. Brock Bowers is the best player in college football. The conversation can be had for other cats as well, but Brock Bowers is absolutely in that, top tier conversation when it comes to what he brings to the table. But I think now if you're trying to defend Georgia, the conversation switches as to how you game plan for them. Because before it was like, hey, number 19, we got to take him away. First, second, third priority, stop Brock Bowers. Well, now it's a little bit more of like, hey, who's it going to be this week? Do we have to give extra attention to Dominique Lovett? Is it Ladd McConkey? Is it Oscar Delp? Like, who's it going to be? And you have a quarterback running the show right now who is just surgical in every sense of the word, completing 73% of his passes, knows where to go with the football every single time. He's put in the work behind closed doors now, and it's paying dividends in front of the entire country. So the way Carson Beck is playing is, I think, sort of supplementing what they don't have with Brock Bowers in the lineup right now. And again, kind of that element of surprise to a degree with which playmaker it's going to be for Georgia, I think, puts a different strain on defenses. Not a better strain, but I think it could kind of be their edge here as they keep on moving without Brock Bowers, and hopefully you get him back sooner rather than later if you're a Georgia fan. But the edge for them, like I said, element of surprise, extremely balanced, best matchup team in college football. Defensively, they don't really miss tackles. They're very seldom out of their assignment, and they're starting to play their best ball in November, as a Kirby Smart team typically does. So Georgia at number 2, I don't have any issue with that. Michigan at 3. And Michigan at 3, I think even the good folks in Ann Arbor understand why they are where they are, and they're not worried about it. Like, they just haven't played anybody too difficult just yet. And some of that's on Michigan of, old and who they haven't scheduled in the past. It's not on anybody that's in the building right now at Michigan. Like, these schedules are set however many years in advance. It is what it is. Now, some of this is also on who they've played in the Big Ten. Like, sorry, Indiana's not bringing their A game this year, not a ranked opponent. Sorry, Nebraska is still kind of in the get-back mode with Matt Rule, not a ranked opponent. Like, you go down the line here, Michigan State, they're not as good as they were previously. They're kind of in shambles. And so some of this is like, hey, you play who you play, but they have been the epitome of dominant to this point. The average margin of victory for them is 35 points a game, not scored. That's margin of victory, average of 35 points a game. J.J. McCarthy has taken ownership of this offense, and the path for them is kind of what I said about Ohio State, and similar to Georgia in a sense, kind of a combination. Like, it's very backloaded in the same way that Georgia is, and it's similar to Ohio State in that it's still that crash course to that game. Yes, the Penn State game will be crucial, have to clear that hurdle, but the Ohio State game, you would imagine, will kind of be the differentiating factor as to what their college football playoff hopes look like. The schedule for them, the comparison in my mind is like the equivalent to a college football strength program, in the sense of whenever you start your schedule for your weight, strength, and training regiment, you typically start out like higher reps, lower weight. And that's just to kind of set the base, get comfortable with the movement, and then as you progress week to week, eventually those number of reps go down and that weight goes up. I think that's where Michigan is right now. When they get to the end of their regiment here, the back half of their schedule, the back 3 games of their schedule, it's heavyweight. It's going to be a 1-game season week to week. At Penn State, at Maryland, Ohio State. 3 1-rep maxes for Michigan in those 3 games. Now, the Maryland game, you're saying, JD, why are you emphasizing that so much? Well, Maryland, not to get too in the weeds here, really good offensive football team. I hate that spot that it's after Penn State and before Ohio State. Ohio State actually had some trouble with Maryland in that exact same spot a season ago. So keep an eye on that one, but it's going to take Michigan's best here at the end. The edge for Michigan, in my mind, the experience they have. A lot made about the personnel, a lot made about the talent they have. They have a lot of guys that are going to get drafted, and we'll talk about that here a little bit later in the show. But like, the experience for me is what separates teams when it comes to November, December, January. Like, look at Georgia last year. They were experienced at the most important spots. Quarterback, offensive coordinator. I think Michigan, with top 5 returning production in the country, is kind of in a similar spot. Across the board, you have a lot of guys here that know what the mission is. They're not like reading the press clippings and saying, that's great, we beat Michigan State. That's great, we beat Indiana. They're like, okay, cool, check the box, on to the next one, happy mission. We also did the same thing last year, and we ended up not playing for a national title. We got to handle business. And so I like that about this team. I think it's going to serve them well the rest of the way. Now for Florida State, they got to throw the blinders on. They're at number 4. The path for Florida State, to put it simply, is like give the committee absolutely zero reason to leave you out. Don't even let it be a second thought. And the way that you do that, you run the table the rest of the way. Handle business in your schedule. Win the ACC, be undefeated. At this point in time, looks like you'll play Louisville for the ACC, but handle Miami, handle Florida the way that you would be, according to Vegas, I would imagine, supposed to handle those teams. Probably going to be favored in both those games. Like, don't even give them a second thought. Don't allow them to try and take away from what Florida State has and what they've done to this point on their schedule, because you're undefeated. You're at number 4. Don't worry if you're at 5 next week. Don't worry if you're at 2 next week. Just blinders on, game by game, handle business. You'll be in the dance. Now, the edge for Florida State, we talk a lot about like NBA basketball players as like get a bucket kind of guys. Like Kevin Durant, probably the best get a bucket guy in the entire planet. Or LeBron James, one of the best get a bucket guys. Like whenever you need to get a bucket, whenever you need to get a matchup, Florida State, I think, is the equivalent of that. Because for Jordan Travis, he's so far along in his development at Florida State. Like he's played a lot of football, gritty, has shown he has the ability to push the ball downfield. But with the number of weapons they have when they're healthy, when Johnny Wilson is playing with a clean bill of health, like there's very few teams in the country that I think can match up with Florida State without having to give extra attention to one guy. And so when you give extra attention to Keon Coleman, Jaheim Bell gets open. Extra attention to Jaheim Bell, Johnny Wilson gets open. So like I was talking about the get a bucket kind of guy, because I think it's the get a matchup kind of team for Florida State offensively. And whenever you can have a matchup, whenever you know without a shadow of a doubt, hey, we will be able to isolate one of our playmakers consistently throughout this game, and he's going to win consistently throughout this game, like I think that's enough on any given Saturday to get it done. So for Florida State, that's the edge. And again, just handle business and you'll be in good shape. Now, really quickly, these last 2 teams, Washington at 5. I would put Washington on boom watch when it comes to this college football playoff field. Now, to give you a little bit of insight to what we call boom watch. Boom watch to me is like this is a team or a player that might be a little bit on the outside looking in, but by nature of what they have ahead of them, by nature of the stages, the schedule, whatever you want to call it, they're about to potentially shoot up the rankings if they handle business. And that's what we had Caleb Williams at this time last year when it came to the Heisman Trophy race. He was kind of in that top 5, maybe even top 10 range when it came to this award. But then that last month of the season, had games against UCLA, against Notre Dame, where he did his thing and shot up the rankings and became the Heisman Trophy winner. Different conversation because it's an award and it's not the college football playoff, but I think the same thing is true for Washington right now. The path for them is at USC, you play Utah and Seattle, you're at Oregon State, you got Washington State. All winnable games. All winnable games. All games that if you're looking at like across the board, the matchups, Washington should be able to handle business and get there. Now, the other thing I would say, I think they can get there with one loss. If it looks the right way and if it's to the right team. Like if you lose to Oregon State, at Oregon State, it's a 3-point loss, and you go handle the business against Washington State the next week, kind of restabilize everyone's perception of you. I think you still find yourself, one, in the Pac-12 title game if things kind of shake out the way that they could for Washington the rest of the way. But if they're a one-loss conference champ, I think you're in the dance, is what I would say. I think you're in the dance because of how good the Pac-12 has been to this point. Now, I understand some of that still has to do with what Oregon State does the rest of the way with that scenario I laid out, but the bottom line is one loss, Pac-12 champ. If it's Washington, I think you're in the deal. Same thing with Oregon now. Oregon's kind of peculiar because they're at 6 right now, and they arguably have the best loss, which is, I hate saying that word, best loss. It's never a good thing to lose. But if you have to have a good loss, they have one to Washington, at Washington, by 3 points. And I think they have the most convincing win in the country. I didn't say best win. I didn't say, they beat the top 3 team in the country or whatever it ended up being. But I'm talking about in terms of like the most convincing statement kind of win. I think they got that in Salt Lake City against Utah, a place where Utah does not lose, just handled business. Handled business. Bo Nix put on a clinic. The path for them is do not slip against teams you're not supposed to slip against. And then USC, Oregon State. Both in Autzen. You don't have a mulligan. You can't lose another game and get to the college football playoff. But the edge for them, in my mind, and we'll talk more about Oregon here in just a little bit, they have a Big Ten team in the trenches, and they have a Pac-12 team on the outside. Meaning they can throw the ball with you, they can stop the run, they can run the ball against you. Like there's so many different weapons within this roster at Oregon. They can play so many different styles. And the roster is built in such a way to where I think they match up well with a Big Ten team, with an SEC team. I'm not saying I'm taking them at a neutral site against Michigan or against Ohio State or against Georgia, but I'm saying if you just look at the matchups, I think Oregon's able to hold their own in those kind of games. And in the Pac-12, I think Oregon's going to be a team that ends up finding their way to that Pac-12 title game. We'll get a rematch against Washington. I think that's a win-in-you're-in kind of game for both those teams. So that'll be a whole lot of fun. to put a finer point on this, ultimately, again, this is like your first test grade in a class. Does it impact the rest of the way for you? Sure it does. 100%. There's no way around it. I mean, definitely has an impact, sets the path for you, but at the exact same time, it doesn't determine anything. So to recap it for you, Oregon at 6, Washington at 5, the first two out on the outside looking in. You got Florida State at 4, Michigan at 3, Georgia at 2, Ohio State at 1. A lot of movement you would imagine to be had, as is typically the case when it comes to the college football playoff. And a lot of conversations about scenarios and what ifs and potentials, which is why we love this time of year to begin with. So that's our thoughts on the playoff and the edge and the path for those top 6 teams. Let's play ball and let's settle it on the field as we always do every single November. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.